Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. I'm continuing my way through on these four books. As I mentioned last week, it probably wasn't a very good idea to add the fourth book to the mix. I was having enough trouble balancing between these three books before adding the fourth one in. But as I also mentioned last week, it's for my work goals. So to a certain extent, it was unavoidable. I felt like I had to prioritize it. So I read a little bit of each of these and a lot of none of these, I regret to say. It's a pity because some of these books were getting interesting, and I would have liked to spend more time reading them, but that was just all the time I had this week. So we'll start with Captain America first. Now, apologies, my camera's going to show everything in mirror image, but maybe you can get the idea. I finished up the last issue, which was back in Captain America's World War II days. Then it transitions to Captain America in the present. Now, in the present meaning 1965 at the time these issues were written. So here he is. They transition by having him tell the story to the rest of the Avengers. Quicksilver, Hawkeye, Scarlet Witch. And then one of the characters mentions about Bucky, and it leads Captain America off into depression. This was part of Stan Lee's Captain America. He was filled with angst. And then it flashes back again to World War II, where we have another connection between World War II and the present day. The Red Skull has set up these sleepers, which awaken. And look at these sleepers that awaken. These are just stereotypical 1950s robots. This was printed in 1965, but when you picture a 1950s science fiction movie, these are the type of robots you would picture, right? I find that interesting because I think a lot of that aesthetic was just determined by lack of budget for the 1950s science fiction movies. I think. Or maybe that's just the way people really imagined robots at that time. But it's interesting that if the aesthetic was determined by lack of budget, it's interesting that it's come in to the animated form here, the comic. Anyways, I was able to finish off at least one issue this week, Captain America, so up to page 160 now. The Linguistics Wars. I was able to finish off chapter 6, which was about generative semantics, the ethos. I'm into a really interesting part of this book. As I mentioned last week, once you make it through chapter 5, at least this was true of the first edition, the heavy linguistic lifting is mostly done. Again, at least that was true of the first edition. We'll see if that's true of the second edition. And you get into more of the cultural and social and political stuff, which I personally find more interesting. I've got a limited capacity for processing complex linguistics. So the generative semantists, which were, the Chomsky's opponents during the Linguistics Wars, were of the hippie generation, or just a little bit older. So they fully embrace the ethos of the 1960s, and it talks about how they incorporate a lot of humor into their writing, a lot of shock value into their writing, even their scholarly writing and the issues that caused. Talks about their politics. Now, they were all very anti-Vietnam War. But the irony, of course, is that their main opponent, Chomsky, was, as Randy Allen Harris points out, like the most tireless advocate against the Vietnam War you could imagine. So there's this irony where they regard him as their mortal enemy, and yet he is doing more for this cause that they're passionate about than all of them combined. I think Randy Allen Harris says it's only a slight exaggeration to say he was doing more anti-war stuff than all of them combined. Talks about just talks about the general culture of generative semantics. And then I made a fair amount of headway into chapter 7, which is generative semantics, the collapse. So this is interesting, and it's told, as in the first edition, it's told in broad enough strokes that you don't really have to follow any of the linguistic arguments to understand what's happening. But basically what was happening is at the end of the 1960s, it looked like Chomsky's theory was on the dustbin of history. And the theory of the generative semanticist was going to be the new way forward in linguistics. But what happened, well, to summarize, basically what happened is they just got too deep into looking at all these problems with the linguistic data without being able to formulate a theory that was able to deal with those problems. And they were doing this partly as reaction to Chomsky. They viewed Chomsky as doing unfair science by sweeping problematic data under the rug. So the generative semantists were going to embrace problematic data, but they really had no theory capable of handling it. It's something that struck me the first time I read this, reading the first edition, and which struck me again reading the second edition, is how much of grammar is still a mystery. I teach grammar. I've talked about grammar before on this channel a lot. I am constantly trying to improve my grammatical knowledge because I teach English. But I always find myself unable to answer questions in the class or unable to explain to students why their sentence is wrong. And I've up until reading this book, I had mostly viewed that as a deficit in my knowledge. Reading this book has made me aware of how many quirks of the English language there are that professional linguists have never wrangled down into a grammatical theory. So that was interesting. The chapter 7, the collapse of generative semanticism or generative semantics, is that they were going off in all these different directions, and the theory just spun out, or there was no center anymore. It was just people going off in different directions. Meanwhile, Chomsky and his graduate students were actually putting meat on the bones of his theory and refining what had been a very loose theory at the beginning of the 60s. And so Chomsky ends up winning the linguistic wars. Now, I'm looking forward to the next few chapters as well, because the first edition was written in the 90s. So this edition is going to continue the story up until the present time, I believe. So there's a chapter on linguistics at the 20th century linguistics at closing time and the aftermath. That'll be interesting to get to when I get to it. How to teach listening. I regret to say that I only got 10 pages read. Did I get 10 pages read? Yeah, 10 pages, exactly, read out of this book. Last week I said my plan was to blitz through this book as quickly as possible, but I just don't have the time. I only got 10 pages read. I'll see if I can do better this week. Those 10 pages were almost all on the types of listening that you can select for your class. So it talked about, in the pages I read for this week, talked about guest speakers, talking about using the recording from the textbook, talked about television, video, DVD, and radio, talked about songs, and talked about the internet. And yeah, this book, when was this published? It's relatively recent, 2008 is when it was published. But, you know, things change so quickly. So, like, yeah, I mean, one of the things that has changed so quickly is just all the video and audio materials on the internet, which makes things like DVDs and cassette tapes and CDs and MP3 players largely obsolete now, right? If there's a song you want to play in your classroom, it's on YouTube. But yeah, that's an example of how quickly things change. The stuff in these pages, in addition to being slightly dated, was well written for what it was. There was nothing earth-shattering. It's largely common sense advice. Like I said in an earlier video, this book is aimed at new teachers, but it's all right. I'm hoping to get more ideas as I continue through it. And then Journey to the West. So where I'm at right now, the monk, the frame story in all of this is there's a monk who's traveling to India to get the Buddhist scriptures. He's accompanied by a monkey and a pig and a couple other disciples, but the monkey and the pigs are the big one. They come to a river that's 250 miles across, and they can't get across it. So they go for the night. They hear this pavilion with music coming out of it, and so they go there to beg for handouts and get fed. And the pig, there's a bit of a humorous scene where the pig is just eating the food so fast and they can't feed him enough. But then while they're there, they ask what's going on with this feast. And it turns out that there's some sort of demon. There are all sorts of demons in this book. But this demon demands a boy and a girl to eat every so often. I forget if it was every year or something. And this demon's terrorizing the village. So they're giving this last feast before they have to part with their daughter and their son. And the monkey volunteers to go in their place. And the monkey volunteers the pig as well. The pig is not so keen on the idea, but monkey says that the pig will do it. They're able to transform their forms. So they disguise themselves as the boy and the girl, and they get themselves presented to the demon. Then before the demon eats them, they fight the demon and drive him out. The demon goes back to his home in the river, where he's surrounded by all his minions, which are other river creatures. There's actually a lot of aquatic scenes in this series. So there's a fish who gives him this advice. Fish says, the Tang priest is a priest who's traveling to India. And this priest, because he's actually the reincarnation of the golden cicada, who's refined his essence over many reincarnations, has flesh that if you eat it, it'll make you immortal. So the fish says, if I tell you how to capture the priest, will you give me some of the flesh and eat it? Let me eat it with you. The demon says yes. And so the fish says, all right, use your powers to create a cold snap and freeze the river over. And then some of us will assume human forms and will walk on the ice. And the Tang priest, because he wants to get across the river, will try and walk across. And then you can unfreeze the river and he'll fall down and you'll be able to eat him. So they do that plan. The river is frozen. The hosts, the people who are hosting the priest and his disciples, urge them not to go across on the ice, but the priest is so impatient that eventually they go across. And then, just like his plan, the demon thaws the river. They all fall into the water. The disciples escape, but the priest, the monk, is captured. Now, the fish persuades the demon not to eat the monk just yet. He says we need to deal with, actually, she. It's specifically identified as a female fish. I don't know why. But this female fish says we need to deal with the disciples first and defeat them, and then we can enjoy the meal in peace. So they just keep the priest locked up in this casket underwater. It's not clear how he's breathing underwater while he's being locked up, but some sort of magic, I guess. And then the monkey and the pig and the other guy, Friar Sand, the other disciple, go into the water to try and rescue the priest after having escaped the first time. Now, there's something I didn't quite understand about how the monkey couldn't travel underwater or something. So the pig agrees to carry him, and the monkey knows that the pig is going to cause trouble. So the monkey does the trick he often does, where he plucks out one of his hairs, which he can transform. And he transforms the hair into a duplicate of himself, and then he transforms into a tick for pigs and hides in the pig's ear. So when the pig throws him off, or throws off what he thinks is the monkey, which is really just the monkey's body double, then the monkey is able to chide him from inside his ear as the tick. It's one of those things. I mean, there are a lot of things in this book where there are all these little kind of pointless discursions or pointless squabbles, or just all this, just extra stuff, which if you were trying to get through this book in a hurry, I'm sure all of that would annoy you. But if you're just going along at your own pace and enjoying the scenery, all this extra stuff does add to the atmosphere of it. Although you do, I mean, it's a huge book for something written in the 16th century, right? I mean, on the one hand, I guess it was before video games, so they had nothing to do all day but sit around and write books. But on the other hand, this huge book before word processors were invented. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, must have been a bear to revise, huh? That you probably didn't revise books back in those days. Anyways, they travel down, they find the Tang priest, and they're setting up to fight with the demon and his aquatic minions. And that's as far as I am here. So yeah, that's the progress I've made on these 4 books this week. Not a bad reading week if you combine all the page totals together, but I regret that I'm not fully able to get immersed in any one of these books, that I'm having to split my attention between them. But yeah, I'll try and finish 1 or 2 of them off and then see where we go from there. I mean, not next week, but sometime soon.